What do they come up with? They come up with 2 training tanks that are armour-plated, are given guns if they go to war, Mark 1 and Mark 2. For the Germans, that's called the Panzerkampfwagen 1 and 2. The 3rd model is this tank, and the 4th model is supposed to be an infantry support tank. A 37mm gun, the standard anti-tank gun the Germans are towing around behind their vehicles. That's put on, but the interesting thing with the German tanks, as often commented on, is the fact that they can be upgraded in service. They've got a large turret ring, and that means you can fit larger guns as they come into service. Now this tank's got a 5cm gun. We said earlier this morning, just in case we're all not tank nerds here today, that's the size of the hole at the end of the barrel, 5cm opening. They also come up for the Panzer IV, a 7.5cm gun that fires high explosive, so rounds that will have blast effect, so they'd be great for firing at infantry positions, buildings, anti-tank guns. They're the Panzer IVs to help the infantry advance. They're like support tanks, and then these tanks, the Panzer IIIs, should go through the gap that has been created, and they're perhaps akin to the British idea of a cruiser tank, a faster tank to exploit the gap. Now we know this vehicle was sent out to Libya. It's reported the Germans were very good at keeping records of all the chassis numbers when they came into the port. We've got photographs after it's captured and it's being debombed in the port of Benghazi. In other words, they're taking all the ammunition out to make it safe to ship back to Britain, where it's taken to Chertsey, just off the M3, just where they called it the tank factory in World War II. School of Tank Technology does all the analysis. So this is one of a number of captured German tanks from North Africa. You can actually see battle damage on it. We're not 100% certain where exactly it was captured at the time, but it's one that we learned lessons from. And I mentioned this morning, it's one of the problems the Tank Museum have, because we have a lot of those tanks in our collection, but a number of them were brought back, and quite often once they finished doing the analysis they didn't always put them back together properly. So we've got some tanks with engine decks that obviously came from a different vehicle that have been placed on top of another vehicle, just to make everybody happy, as it were. Now this particular Panzer III, it's the Model L. The Germans, they have a system, so as you go through each improvement it becomes a new Ausrung, A, B, C, D, and you give a letter to each one that's going through that improvement. This is an L model Panzer III, and it's even more special in the sense that it's got that new 5cm gun, it's got extra armour plate put on the front, because again, the British in particular, when this is fighting, it's British troops and Commonwealth troops is fighting against, we're getting new 6-pounder anti-tank guns into service. You're going to need more armour protection to protect yourself against that. But this one's got the 5cm gun. It's also tropicalised, tropen, TP. That means it's got extra things done to it to help it survive in the Western Desert. And just like our Tiger that served, famous Tiger 131 serves out in Tunisia, that was also tropicalised. It's got extra filters to try and suck out more of the dust before it gets in and ruins your engine. So that's our L model Panzer III. It's been a runner at the museum for many, many years. It's now back in the colours that it was captured in, this Dunkelgelb as it was called, the colour that the Germans painted an awful lot of their vehicles, sometimes putting a camouflage scheme on the top, but it seemed to be a colour they pick on that they think will work not just for North Africa but the North West Europe campaign as well. Now we're very lucky here, we've had over the last few years on loan to us this particular tank. It's called a Hargo, and it's being a Japanese tank from the Second World War. It's been followed on by an M3 Stuart tank, and these are 2 tanks that fought against each other out in the Far East. The Hargo, privately owned, it was taken back to Japan from a Polynesian island. It'd been left behind, basically the Americans didn't, they bypassed the island. After the war, some of them were taken to Japan, some of them were scrapped. This particular one sat on the island for many, many years, ended up in Japan, then came to Europe, has been restored mainly in Poland, and sometime soon, over the next few years, it'll probably end up going back to Japan, to a new military museum that's opening there. So we're lucky to have it here. But the Hago, the Japanese, they've got a heavy tank in the early 1930s. They import a British tank. That tank, petrol driven, catches fire, and some of the crew get badly burned. That leads the Japanese to go for a diesel engine. So this is actually a tank that's powered by a Mitsubishi diesel engine. The whole vehicle designed by a Japanese tank designer called Tomio Hara. It's got a weird sort of suspension system. It's called bell crank suspension, but there's a tube between those two sets of bogies, as it's called, and that tries to dampen down the rocking effect that you'll see as that vehicle drives along. It was notorious for making some of the crews sick because of the way it rocks back and forward. Again, from the crew's point of view, it was lined with asbestos. Those were the days we thought asbestos was great for everything, kept the heat down and acted as a bit of padding. Subsequently, that of course has had to be removed from this vehicle. 37mm gun, it would fire high explosive or armour piercing, not that powerful, but it was good enough for most of the enemies the Hagos fought against, because in the Far East very few other countries had tanks at this time of the war. Now, following on behind it, this M3 Stuart tank, we've talked already about the Americans in the interwar period. They try to hang on the whole to they spend their money on their defence budget, which isn't a lot. They spend it on keeping men in service. They do little experiments, but they build very few actual fleets of vehicles. The American answer is, we're going to throw money at the problem if war comes, and it works for them. So in 1941, for the first time, the M3 Stuart goes into production. It's called the Stuart tank because Winston Churchill, he's fed up of hearing all these abbreviations, M3A1, M3 this, M4. What do they all mean? Give them names so I can remember them. So the British call American tanks after Civil War generals. Jeb Stuart, hence this becomes the Stuart tank, and the Americans pick up on it and use it as well. The M3 version, 37mm gun, it's got a radial engine in the back. That's an aircraft engine, and that means it's big and round. Think of them on the front of aeroplanes, Dakotas, etc. They're using an aeroplane engine, and unfortunately that makes it quite high as a vehicle. So the height of the vehicle is because basically the drive shaft comes out the middle and runs all the way through to those sprocketed wheels at the front of the vehicle. The downside of the M3 was that aircraft engine is ridiculously thirsty. You could go 75 miles in a Stuart before you ran out of petrol, and that's only half the distance of, say, the British Crusader tanks that they're fighting with out in the Western Desert. Hence those extra fuel tanks bolted on the side so you can keep going a bit longer. 37mm gun, armour protection that wasn't that dissimilar to the early German tanks at the time, but the British first used them in the Crusader battles at the end of 1941. We end up using them like tanks. The Americans really designed them for scouting vehicles, cavalry type vehicles at the time. And that's in British colours, and it would have been used in North Africa at that sort of period. It's replaced later by another version called, they don't want to call it the M4, it sounds all very confusing, this M3, M4, because they know it'll get confused with the M4 Sherman, so they call the next version the M5. And it has a new engine in the back, thicker armour, all the sorts of things we see happening to tanks in World War II, this guns versus armour race. You need more protection and you need more firepower to get through the enemy's armour. Now, real rarity here, another one of those wonderful privately owned vehicles restored from an absolute wreck of a hull, found in the basement of one of the factories that made it. This is a Valentine tank, but it's a particular type of Valentine that was converted so it would float on water. This is a DD. They call them DD's duplex drive. Two ways of driving them. When it goes past you, if you look at the rear of it, there's actually a propeller, and that can engage with the engine spin round and make that tank float through water. How it floats is the screen. You can see what looks like a sausage round the hull. That's actually canvas. That can actually be raised and the struts keep it out, and that displaces enough water that you can float that tank. Now this is all come up with by a Hungarian chap who's working in Britain, Nicholas Strausler, who's designed some armoured cars. He realises we're going to need vehicles that can float across rivers. In Britain, we've even tried that in the First World War, we're trying to float a tank. What he does, he starts with a little light Tetrarch tank, he moves on to the Valentine. He's tried all sorts of things. He tries pods, whopping great flotation tanks on the side, but then he goes for this idea of, let's put a canvas screen up, displace the water, we'll float ashore. The downside for the Valentine, look at that gun, it's over the front of the tank, though they decide for D-Day, we're going to convert Sherman tanks, doing the same system, screen up the sides, but the Sherman gun is much shorter, so it can face forward. As soon as the screen drops, they can start firing at the enemy positions. Now the Valentine is an important tank for Britain. We make over 8,000 of them in the war. It's a tank we make the most of. It was originally designed to replace Matilda II as what was called an infantry tank. It was to support the infantry attacking prepared positions. Thick armour on the front, relatively slow, that didn't matter, but we were so short of cruiser tanks out in the Western Desert, we ended up using this in a different role. It starts off again, the 2-pounder gun, we then had the 6-pounder on some of them, and then a bored out 6-pounder gun that we called a 57mm. It basically took American ammunition. So a more powerful gun going on. The problem was, as soon as you put a bigger gun on, they had to lose a crew member from the turret, which means the commander's a bit overloaded because he's got a basically commander and gunner, as opposed to you want a loader as well, otherwise the poor guy in charge is trying to do too many operations at the same time. In the back they had two models of basically a diesel engine. They were using a bus engine, AEC, a bus engine there, and they move on to a more powerful engine during its production run. Now just before D-Day, down not far from here in Studland Harbour, down near Poole, they had an exercise where 6 of these Valentines, the sea was a bit rough, 6 of them sunk, 6 guys' lives were lost. And the British learned the lesson. If the sea is rough, take your tanks as close to the shore as you dare before launching them on D-Day. The whole principle was, if one landing craft with all the tanks on gets hit and sunk, how are they going to support the infantry? If we spread those tanks out, at least some of them are going to get ashore and take on those cleverly defended German machine guns and anti-tank positions that are hiding on the beaches. They needed that armour support. And 2,000 Valentines are made in Canada, most of which are gifted to the Soviet Union as part of Lend-Lease arrangements, keeping the Russian army going. Classic Sherman coming on. This particular Sherman, we'll talk about them a little bit more later on. This one's got a bit of a longer hull, and it's got something called a Chrysler multi-bank engine in. I said earlier about radial engines, aeroplane ones. The American industries are making as many engines as they can. Aeroplanes have the priority. So planes first, same in Britain. Churchill says tanks are secondary. Let's get more fighters to defend ourselves, bombers to get back at Germany. So tanks in Britain have secondary importance. In America, what goes on, they end up getting other companies to make new engines, not just aeroplane engines, for the tanks. And that particular one, you get 5 engines bolted together, Chrysler car engines, with one central crank. They had to make the tank a little bit longer, so if you're a bit of a nerd and you look at these ones, how do you tell them all apart? This has got a longer body, this particular model Sherman. It's got the 75mm gun. Behind it, the M16 with that 4 quad mount 50 caliber machine guns. M18 Hellcat, one that's banging away there. That is another vehicle that's not a tank, But the Americans in 1940, as we were saying earlier, they realised now they're going to be involved in the war. They make vehicles for their new armoured divisions with the idea of exploitation. But what happens when enemy tanks come the other way? What are we going to do about that? So they've got towed anti-tank guns, which you can take to where you think the enemy are coming, but the Americans come up with the idea of the tank destroyer. And they create, under a Lieutenant Colonel Bruce, a new unit based at Fort Hood. It's going to become Tank Destroyer Command, and they make speedier vehicles with thin armour to carry an anti-tank gun. And the idea is, if there's an enemy breakthrough of tanks, you rush your tank destroyers there and ambush the enemy. Now, it sounded good in theory. In practice, it didn't quite work. Now, this particular vehicle, they start with GMC half-tracks, not dissimilar to our M16. You put your anti-tank gun on top of that. They then move on to something called the M10. They get a Sherman running gear, thin armour plate, and a big gun on the top. That becomes the M10. This is a later model. They wanted speed. The guy in charge, this Lieutenant Colonel Bruce, really keen to get a fast vehicle. And that's what they've done with this M18, what was known as the Hellcat. It's got a radial engine, so again, another aeroplane engine in the back. The R975, the same engine that's in some of the Shermans. It's got very thin armour. It's about ½ inch thick. It'll stop a bullet, but not much else. They've made the top open, so the crew have got really good visibility all around. And they started by putting on the 37mm gun, realised that wasn't going to be good enough. They move on to the same 75mm on the Sherman, and then they put the gun on that goes on those later model Shermans you'll be seeing in a moment, the 76mm. Only a millimetre bigger, but longer, with higher velocity rounds being fired out the end. In other words, much more welly going behind the metal projectile that's fired out to smash through more enemy armour. So the Hellcats, they cease service after the in the Italian campaign, the landings at Anzio, but quickly the doctrine of this idea of tank destroyers is questioned by the Americans in charge. Patton says it doesn't really work in Tunisia. The word goes back, we're not too sure this is a way of doing things. Because the idea you can get your right type of vehicle in the right place at the right time is questioned. Is it better to not just have well-armed tanks all over the place to deal with enemy tanks should they advance? So they stopped making the Hellcat very early in its production run. They were going to make a lot of them. They only make about 2,000, which sounds a lot, but it's nowhere near the 8,000 they'd originally planned. They are ended up being distributed to help infantry units rather than play their role. There's a couple of times they managed to do what they were intended to do. One of them at a battle called Arracourt, where the Germans end up sending forward some of their new Panthers, not very well trained crews. 4 of these M18 Hellcats are knocked out, but they managed to destroy just over 30 German tanks in that particular engagement. And there's another time as well in the Battle of the Bulge where it's known the Germans are advancing towards a certain village, and the speed, and you're talking about a vehicle that can get up to 55 miles an hour, this Hellcat, they managed to race ahead, get to the crossroad of the village and stop the Germans capturing it. So they do have their moments in the war, but it's often been discussed, this doctrine of the tank destroyer doesn't really seem to work in practice, even though it sounds like a nice idea. Now this particular M18, at the end of World War II, some of them went back to America, they had some upgrades put on them, and they were used to help bolster armies that were reforming in Europe, and later this one was sent to Tito in Yugoslavia. The Americans had a program, we were trying to persuade Tito not to go to communist or Soviet Russia as a backer. Why not get stuff you need from the West? And if you've all watched your Kelly's Hero movies, those Sherman tanks in Kelly's Heroes are some of those tanks that America supplied to Yugoslavia. British Hellcat went there as well, and it ended up being seen action later in the fighting when Yugoslavia falls apart in the 1980s. And if you get the chance, go and have a look at it, because you can actually see, talk to the owner, you can see the hole in the front when it was knocked out. They've still got, and you can also see there that half-inch armour plate, how thin it is, even though that does look quite big and butch. So you can see everyone gets all worked up when we call things a tank, when they're not a tank. If you want to win your pub quiz, this one's a tank destroyer. M18, the tank destroyer. Now, next one coming on, another one of those classics from the Second World War. Just before the Second World War, the Russians start putting a heavy tank into production, the KV-1. There's a rival tank factory, and a guy called Mikhail Koshkin has come up with his design for a relatively heavy tank for the Red Army. The Red Army aren't that bothered about it at the time. Stalin gets wind of it, likes the design, and says to the Red Army, "You're going to want this, aren't you?" And of course the Red Army immediately turns around and says, "Absolutely, it's the best thing since sliced bread." So this goes into service just in 1940-41. The first ones are being issued to the Red Army. The problem for the Red Army at the time, Stalin has killed 30,000 of their officer class. They are decimated in terms of their leadership, just when, in the summer of 41, the Germans invade. Now, that T-34, the original ones went into action with a smaller gun, 76mm gun. This is one that was built in response to the German Panther tank that they see in 1943. They have a new model tank. The Russians decide, shall we build it? T-44 it was going to be called, but quite sensibly, instead of stopping all the factories, they say, no, let's do an evolutionary role and just build the tanks, carry on building them, but we're just going to give them a newer turret. So that turret now has enough room for 3 crew members instead of 2 in it, so you've got that commander, gunner and loader, so it can fire quicker, and it's got a new 85mm gun, more powerful, more chance of penetrating the German armour. So the T-34 goes into production from later in 43, and it sees out the Russian army to the end of the war. Lots and lots made, estimates around 70,000 of them. It's also the most knocked out tank in World War II because they suffer enormous losses at the hands of German anti-tank gunners, Panzerfaust, etc. These are used by the Russians almost like in the West we might use a hand grenade. If you need 20 of them to get through to the next village, don't worry, we've got another 20 waiting for you that we'll issue later on. So that they see a huge attritional rate, very rough on the crews, but they work. It's a very simple design and it's simplified during its production run. Compared, if you look at one of these to an early war one, lots of bits are left off it. There's times some of these left the factory without even a seat for the driver. This particular one we think was made after the war in Poland. They carried on making them, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and amazingly enough, there's photos of a T-34-85 still in use to this day fighting out in Yemen. So it's another one of these tanks that saw lots of service after World War II. We've seen our Chaffee come on a little bit earlier. This is the American replacement for the M5 version of the Stuart tank we saw earlier. Again, this is put together. Ultimately, they put a requirement out, 75mm gun. It's not the same gun as on the Sherman. It's a gun that was actually originally designed for the B-25 Mitchell bomber. They were going to use it to fire at ground targets. Thinner wall, lighter, and it was great to fit in a light tank. So they used that, so it's got some firepower. Again, they're looking at things like torsion bar suspension, which makes it fast across. And the design team at Buick that come up with this is under a guy called Harley Earl, and he ends up being the guy that puts fins on Buick cars in the 1950s. So he's one of these designers that he does his war service, cuts his teeth on making this Chaffee tank. This particular one, privately owned, again it's here, it's in British markings. It's being marked up as Bill Bellamy's tank. Bill Bellamy wrote a wonderful memoir of his wartime experiences. 1945, he's issued with one of the first Lend-Lease Chaffies that goes across to British forces, and that's what this one looks like. And again, many armies after the Second World War, the Americans have a large stock of these tanks. They leave some in Europe and they're redistributed. So you've got Chaffies that seen service out in Vietnam, in all sorts around the world, because again, they're smaller, lighter, and that of course goes down very well, especially if you're in a country that doesn't have you know, much in the way of infrastructure. You don't want too many roads being chewed up. Down the far end, that tank moving off there with that beautiful, beautiful engine though, that's the British Comet tank. It's a cruiser tank. We finally get our act together towards the end of the war. As I mentioned earlier, Churchill says planes are much more important to defend Britain in that First War period. We start making a tank called the Cromwell. It's that we don't have enough engines for it. They start with a Liberty engine, this development from a First World War American engine. We start using an engine called the Meteor, and it's put together by a chap with a great name, Rumty Rowbottom, works for Rolls-Royce. He's a designer, and his Belper works for Rolls-Royce. They haven't got that much work there, so he picks up crashed Merlins, the Spitfire and the Hurricane and the engine from the Lancaster bomber. He gets crashed versions of that and starts converting them to make up an engine derated that will fit in a tank. And ultimately that becomes what's called the Meteor. And by the middle of the war we're able to start building those. We're less worried about being invaded. We can start making these engines to go in tanks. So they go in the Cromwell, and they make that tank so ridiculously fast it will shake the tank apart unless you derate the engine. And we also put it into this tank, the next version in that family, the Comet. Now that engine gives this vehicle speed and power, about 600 horsepower, that Meteor engine. And this is also a tank that has now got the new British 77mm high velocity gun. Gives it about a third more penetration than the standard 17-pounder. And this made this a better gun for penetrating armour than that famous gun on the Panther tank, the 7.5cm on the Panther. So at last, at this stage of the war, not only have we got a reliable engine in the Meteor, the power to get it around the battlefield, and a really effective anti-tank gun. So Comet gets to action early in 1945. They're issued, sees some work before the end of the war, and it goes on in British service. Some of them were reserves to the 60s. They were sold on to Finland, Burma, various other countries as well.